All right, perfect, everyone. So we are starting. So welcome. Thank you for coming to the ethnobotany class. Uh, this is the second class in our series. Last month we talked about paleobotany, and so this month we're talking about ethnobotany, and then next month is going to be on medicinal botany. Um, I think the first question that we kind of want to bring up, of course, is what defines ethnobotany? What exactly does that mean? And just, from, of course, a purely dictionary example here, it is the scientific study of the traditional knowledge and customs of a people concerning plants and their medical, religious, and other uses. And so really ethnobotany is all about the relationship between people and plants. Really since, you know, our history, since our origins. I mean, in order for humans to have survived as long as we have relied on plants for a number of uses. And so they are of great importance to us. And so, plants just in general, if you did not have plants, I mean, you would not have a planet. I mean, because they are so critical to our ecosystems, to all other life on this planet. And so really today, what we're going to focus on is kind of strictly more that relationship between plants and people, okay? Not as much focus kind of on plants' roles in the other aspects of the environment. Today, we're going to kind of learn more about, um, the different uses of plants among people over time. And so, I've kind of already gotten ahead of myself here, but that's going to be kind of our focus today. So we've depended on plants um, over thousands of years. People, different cultures, different civilizations have used plants and even tested plants for different uses. So whether that's to figure out if this is a good food source or if there's a medicinal aspect, to maybe this is something that is very strong and durable that could be used as construction materials. We're going to talk about those different things. And so, just as we pass down other knowledge, throughout history, of course, we're passing down the knowledge of plants and their usefulness, what benefits humanity from generation to generation. And so with that comes things such as, is this plant toxic to humans? Is this actually a good food source for humans? All of that is knowledge that maybe we have recorded it, maybe it was written down, or it was passed by word of mouth over periods of time. And so really what that comes down to is the role that plants play in our lives and humanity's life, it just in humanity in general, from 1,000 years ago to currently, all of that is so important because it really helps to better understand, you know, what humans rely on and what role these plants are playing in our lives. And so really just kind of focusing in on the importance that plants have. um, of course, I say all this and it sounds in a way it sounds very selfish, right? It kind of sounds like, and I'm trying not to make it out like this, where like it's just take. Humans are just taking and taking, which, unfortunately, we are seeing quite a bit of that in our world. Um, but I think it's, also important to just kind of, look at this from the perspective that, humans need plants and we have to show this great appreciation for plants. And in many ways, let's try to have kind of more of this symbiotic relationship versus humans just taking, just selfishly for our own purposes. So it's going to kind of, when I talk about some of the different things today, it kind of is going to feel like that. So I just kind of wanted to mention it, that it's like, we we really need to kind of look at plants as a whole and their importance to this planet, and not only their importance to people, but to the environment. And we need to, you know, in many ways show appreciation for what they give. And as a result, we need to do our part to try to give back as well. So anyway, kind of gone off on a little bit of a tangent there. So let's kind of move on with the presentation here. And so, with humans relying so much on plants for our existence, what are some of the different things that we may utilize plants for? And these are the different things that we're going to talk about today. So plants provide, of course, first and foremost, a food source for us. They're medicine. They provide shelter. We may use them for different dyes, different fibers. We get into kind of utilizing plant oils, resins, gums, the waxes, latex for different uses, our soaps, just everything in general. And of course, just providing the oxygen that we breathe in order for us to kind of live in a healthier setting. All of these things are important. But let's kind of like dive into this a little bit more here. So first and foremost, let's talk about food. So let's talk about humanity's relationship with plants in regards to food. And so, of course, as long as humans have been around, we have utilized plants as a food nourishment, okay, that we need in order to survive. And actually, over time, humans started to really kind of have more of a role when it comes to plant management. They kind of learned how to handle plants, how to cultivate plants. That's kind of the beginnings of agriculture, if you will. That's kind of the start of our history where humans were able to start growing plants and rather than actually just strictly foraging them. And for that matter, not only learning how to grow and propagate plants to use for food, but eventually figuring out the genetics of it all and how to breed plants to get desired traits. And so that's a big aspect of our history. Is humans have, over many years and all around the world, have been able to kind of manage plants, but then alter the habitat in which they live for their interests, for their needs. So that, just to kind of give an example, that could be anything from burning an open forest, burning off old stems of plants to help stimulate new growth, kind of revitalizing that area, especially, traditionally in the United States, where we did have a lot of open prairies where fires were kind of a natural part of, revitalizing a lot of the organisms that were there. And so humans kind of learning this, and being able to actually utilize fire once they were able to utilize fire, then kind of, again, took advantage in a way to promote their own interests of using these areas for food production. And so some other aspects of this, with food production, again, the start of agriculture, the start of cultivation, being able to sow seeds from plants that they have collected, even learning how to properly propagate plants, things of that nature. Humans have been able to kind of figure that out over time and utilize that. So, kind of with that in mind, we talk about the aspect of domestication, right? I know we think about really more animal domestication when we hear the word domestication, but really it's food domestication. You know, people over time have grown different crops. They have found crops in the wild species, and over time they have been able to, in many aspects, breed these plants to their desired traits that they want. And so now we have a lot of our food crops that we see now, are definitely altered in a way, if you think about it, from their wild types. Like most of the crops that we have today that we have as our main source of food crops look very different after hundreds to thousands of years of constantly breeding the desired traits. And so it's almost unrecognizable to even imagine what the wild types looked like say thousands of years ago. They may not have even been as edible. But because humans have been able to kind of learn these techniques to grow and to breed, that's how we get a lot of the crops that we have today. And so, this again is occurring all across the world. And just to kind of give you some examples of where certain crops have been domesticated, you can kind of see this list here, such as, for example, in the Middle East, it was very common for a lot of our grain crops, like our wheat, barley, and oats were domesticated, our apples and our figs. Africa was barley, millet, coffee, okra. The Far East was your rice, soybeans, ginger. Mesoamerica, corn, beans, squash, cacao. South America, a lot of your solanaceous crops like your potatoes and your tomatoes. Europe, things like your olive, beets, basil, oregano, a lot of herbs in the Mediterranean region. And then, of course, North America, things like your sunflowers, your blueberries, your pecans, were all domesticated by the different, indigenous groups that were there at the time. And of course, as people learned to explore the world and traveled, they brought crops with them and they grew crops in these new lands that they discovered as well. And so, of course, there's definitely heavy influence there with some of this domestication. So just in America alone, in the United States, our indigenous people, our Native Americans, they were able to essentially domesticate over probably about 1,600 different plant species that were recorded as providing a food source or even for medicinal purposes. So, it's it's very interesting when you hear something like that because very much at times it seems like we stick to the same food crops. It's almost like the same 20 or so food crops over and over again, when really there's just a whole world, a whole environment of plants that can be utilized in food production that maybe we unfortunately forgot about. Maybe the knowledge had been lost, unfortunately, because of the changes in civilizations and cultures, which is a shame. And hopefully there is more research to kind of bring that back because there is a way that these plants should be kind of utilized to their fullest potential, if you will. And so again, kind of looking beyond these traditional crops, there's so many more plants that are around and available for use as a food crop that we just may not even think about. That may even be in our own backyard. So let's go from food and let's talk about medicine. So I'm not going to get into this too much because we're getting into medicinal botany, a whole class on that next month. But of course, with plants, the roles that they play is over time, people have discovered that plants could be used for the treatment of different ailments. That can be anything from treating superficial wounds, maybe plants that have kind of more of these antiseptic properties. Um, that you can put over, say, a burn or, an open wound to help prevent infection. Or maybe they discovered a plant that treats, different internal ailments like gastrointestinal problems, things of that nature. And it's interesting because when you think about that and food crops, like a lot of that must have been trial and error, right? I mean, a lot of people must have been curious at one point to be like, oh, I'm going to try this plant, or just maybe by a happy accident discovered, oh, wait, this I brushed up against this plant and this is creating this effect on my skin. I mean, different things like that, over time, um, trying to understand, the true, the different purposes that plants serve and how they can benefit humans. It's quite interesting. Um, so, when we think about medicinal purposes, a lot of, I'll say, kind of recorded history on medicinal purposes of plants kind of goes back to a lot of our philosophers, right? Especially in Greece. We have different philosophers like, um, Aristotle, uh, that did keep a record of different medicinal purposes for plants. Um, Dioscorides, he created, he was a major contributor where he did the De Materia Medica, and that document was kind of this kind of compilation, if you will, of 500 plant species actually documented, where they could be utilized or prepared to make over 1,000 different types of medicines for different uses. So, I mean, that was quite extraordinary. That was, probably in about, I think it was about 60 AD or so, like that this is happening. And so you have some of these, again, like I said, different philosophers, different scholars that are recording some of this information. Now, with that said, some of that information may not have been the best, or the most reliable, because, um, um, not to like, make fun of Dioscorides or anything like that, but he did also kind of help with the terminology, if you will, of, if any of you all are familiar with the doctrine of signatures. The doctrine of signatures was where people kind of believed that a plant's physical appearance, indicated that it had medicinal properties. Like, so let me give an example. The plant lungwort. The plant lungwort, the foliage kind of resembles that of a lung. And so then you get into, oh, if this is shaped like this organ in my body, then it must be used to serve that purpose. It must be used medicinally to help any ailments that I might have of the lungs or the kidneys or, anything like that. And so, you get a little bit of, false information, if you will, where there was this belief that was held for a period of time that, like I said, basically the shape, of the plant, if it looked like this organ, meant that it must help with treating the ailments of this organ. And that's just not true. Of course, we have completely debunked that, but that is in a lot of early records here. Now, with that said, of course, we have since, over time, again, whether it's recorded or by word of mouth, learned of the benefits of plants medicinally, and that there are ones that truly do help us. So much of our modern medicine and treatments of different ailments today are still using plants as the basis for it. It's not all artificial, it's not all synthetic. A lot of the building blocks for modern medicine, of course, still come from plants. And so we definitely, like I said, maybe want to show some appreciation for that, for what all they do for us. Um, and of course, there are so many plants that have yet to be discovered, of course, that may have medicinal purposes. So again, I'll kind of touch on that more next month, but I can give a whole talk on medicinal medicine, medicinal plants. So let's go into what are some other things that, of course, plants are used for. Uh, everyone, I mean, this is going to be very obvious. Some of these are very obvious, but of course, shelter, right? So when humanity started to, be able to utilize tools or create tools, then they were able to start to build structures to help protect them from the different environmental elements, from weather, from wind, from rain. And so plants were used as building materials for that. So, I mean, very easily, trees, tall grasses, things of that nature provided the timber or the fibrous material to help build not only the structures of these homes, but also even the roofing material, things like that. And even to this day, even though, again, we're kind of in a world where it feels like so much is synthetically made, we still utilize natural plant products, such as, bamboo or timber, in aspects of our home or like in the flooring of our home, different things of that nature. So, again, kind of more of an obvious one, but a perfect example there. Another example, fibers. So plant fibers are basically, they come from the outer portion of the stem or from the leaves. So humans had been able to kind of take from the plants and spin them into these different types of threads or filaments, to create materials. So of course, plant fibers, not only for clothing, of course, but just in other types of textiles, woven them into baskets, into rugs. Of course, we think of just paper as well, how history started with, even using papyrus. I mean, those fibers were essential, for people over time and still are to this day. One of the examples that I love, to talk about is, because our book club had read a book on it, is on sweetgrass and how the Native Americans use sweetgrass. They use that material for different things, such as basket weaving, for sewing. Even today, it may still be a material used in mattresses or pillows. Um, but it was kind of multi-purpose. That's what Sweetgrass was able to do. And so, again, I think it's always a good idea if you look back at the history and talk to our indigenous cultures, because there's so much knowledge there. They had a great understanding of the land and the plants that resided there and what their purposes were. And so that's such wonderful knowledge for us to even continue to this day. And so you're going to kind of hear me say a little bit more about that, especially kind of talking about our indigenous, culture, and kind of what are some of the different things that they use the plants here in the Americas for. So another example would be natural dyes. So we think of a lot of synthetic dyes, and honestly, I know, I know there's a lot of drama going on right now with artificial synthetic dyes, and so, whether people would like to use them or not, or use them in food, or using them in clothing, or whatever, if you will. Um, Dyes have been used for many thousands of years, natural dyes where plants are used to help add different color, whether that have been back then to add to animal skin or to add it to some of the fibrous materials to some of the textiles. It was used quite commonly, and there were different plants that secreted, if you would, different dyes just from the sap that may have been in their stem or leaves or even in the roots. Um, and so, for an example, and you can kind of see this list here, Native Americans use several different types of plants for different dyes. And the one I'll kind of showcase here is bloodroot, because bloodroot is one a lot of us around here are very familiar with. It's one of our beautiful kind of native ephemeral plants that we see bloom in the spring, and then it just kind of comes and goes, and then it's gone. But with bloodroot has kind of more of a rhizomatous structure where it has these underground stems and roots that when you cut them, it secretes this kind of reddish sap, if you will. And so that reddish sap was used as a dye by the Native American people. And so, different plants may secrete different saps that might end up being different colors like blacks or yellows or things like that. So this kind of gives you a little bit of an idea with this list, what some of these plants were utilized for with the dyes. Let's also talk about oils and the importance of oils for humans, and kind of what goes into that. And so oils, when we talk about plant oils, a lot of times we think about vegetable oils. A lot of times these oils um, are kind of pressed from seeds, or they're kind of extracted from different parts of the plants. But it can be anything from the seeds, the flower, the roots, the leaves, what have you. You can extract oils from pretty much every type of structure of the plant. And depending on the plant species, some of these oils that are extracted may have a smell. They may have a flavor to them. Some may be stronger than others. A lot of our herbs, for example, a lot of our plants in the Lamiaceae family, the mint family, have pretty strong oils. And a lot of those oils in that aspect, especially those very fragrant one, may be used not only back in history, but in modern day for things in soaps and perfumes and different toiletry products, cosmetics, things of that nature. Whereas you have other oils, such as your vegetable oils, that are important in food production that we use, pretty much regularly in food production. And so a lot of those are kind of your soybeans, your palm, your rape, and your sunflower oils. Canola oil is another common one. And so, we kind of rely on these oils very much in our cooking. But with that said, even things like sunflower oil, for example, may also have different purposes. We might be able to use it, in the construction industry, in different industrial purposes. Some oils are used to make paint and varnish. I mean, we may not even think of that a lot of the oils we use maybe come from natural products originally. So that just kind of gives you an idea of, like I said, we think a lot about eating our food crops, but what about some of the extracts? What do we use with some of that? And so oils are a perfect example of what we need, um, especially in modern day. So let's talk about something else that can be extracted or exuded, if you will. I'm using kind of interesting terms here, but there's what we call plant resins. And a lot of time when we think of the word resin, we think of ooey gooiness, right? We think of kind of this ooey secretion by the plant. And to give you like a very specific definition, Typically, resins are not soluble in water. They harden as soon as they are exposed to air. Usually, they don't play a fundamental process for the plant. And then most times, it's woody plants that are secreting resins. So we see this with a lot of our tree species. We see this with a lot of our evergreens, if you will, that secrete these resins. A lot of times these resins come out when there is an injury to the plant, whenever that tissue is cut. And so when humans kind of discovered what was kind of exuding from these injuries, if you will, um, they found that they could use those for different purposes, interestingly. So some of the more fragrant resins, if you were used to make incense, very much things like frankincense, if you will, is an example of that. Um, Other resins might be used to help to waterproof ropes and tarps, and even is used in the shipping industry quite often. And then, of course, they may be used as a varnish or a lacquer as well. So and sometimes interesting too, plant resins may even serve a little bit of a medicinal purpose, where some of the resins that are taken from the plants, sometimes they have been used for the treatment of different ailments, like if you have a cold, like the common cold, or if you have a cough, they've been used to be treated for that. And then interesting too, something we don't think about. Is kind of the resin that we think of amber, that beautiful, vibrant amber, orangey color that I'm going to use a reference. Of course, everyone thinks of the piece of amber in Jurassic Park, right? In the movie Jurassic Park. And oftentimes with amber, there's like insects that are stuck inside of it. It shows kind of this preservation of these different insects or other organisms that are in that enclosed amber. Amber is kind of a perfect example of resin. And in fact, that people actually kind of thought of things like amber for spiritual purposes. Like it was good to have amber around because it would help to ward off evil spirits and things like that. So, just cultures over time have made these roles for these different plant materials. So just kind of something very, very unique. So we're going into, like I said, we're going into a lot of things that are kind of extracted from plants and some of the kind of ooey gooey-ness, if you will. Let's talk about plant gums and waxes. So we're going to continue this from resins to gums and waxes. Um, so there are natural gums, and usually they're just kind of this compilation of these sugars. Um, that are typically water soluble, or they're capable of absorbing water, widely used as thickening agents, emulsifiers, stabilizers in different industries today. Kind of very commonly used for that. Kind of traditionally, though, with actual gum, natural gums, the Native Americans would actually use spruce sap. They would use spruce sap kind of as a natural gum, and I mean like a chewing gum. And they actually taught this to the colonists that arrived into the Americas. And the colonists would start to use natural chewing gum, if you will, and that kind of went commercial. And that's kind of where the history and the basis of some of our chewing gum comes from. So literally, I am talking about gum, if you will. Something else, wax. So wax is a very common natural component with plants, serves as a protective coating traditionally on leaves, stems, and even some fruits. And actually, that wax coating can be used to make different things, and traditionally was used to make candles. So I know a lot of times we use say beeswax, for example, or but even things like making soy candles, but candles, it maybe not as much today, but years ago were made by natural plant materials, by those natural wax coatings. So very neat from that angle. All right, soaps. So, you know, plants are interesting in that, of course, we're not just talking about a bar of soap here, um, but plants contain these types of steroids called saponins, and they dissolve in water and create this kind of froth, if you will. And we kind of get that from a specific plant, the soapwort plant that some of you might be familiar with, kind of as an herbal plant, if you will. And its roots, the roots of these plants were traditionally used to make this kind of soap that you use to bathe with. Um, and in fact, what the Egyptians did, and, for many, many years, is they would take these natural plant saponins and they would combine that with your different animal fats, even some vegetable oils, to create these bars of soaps. That's kind of where all this comes from. And they would bathe using that. So not really thinking about, oh, plants were kind of important for, overall cleanliness, if you will, by people. And even today, um, although our bars of soap may be made with other products, so to speak, a lot of times they use kind of essential oils, if you will. They use different plant oils to help add fragrance to the soaps. So rose is a very common one. We think of lavender, even cedar wood, if you want kind of that woody smell, is commonly used. All right, latex and tannins. So, for a lot of you will be familiar with latex because a lot of plants that we may grow in our gardens or in our homes contain latex. Latex is traditionally, this kind of white milky substance. It does not have to be white or milky. Sometimes it is kind of thinner and more of a yellowish color. Um, but a lot of times when plants are injured, they will exude this latex sap. Traditionally kind of more as a protective mechanism for them. But people kind of learned it's like, oh, this sap could actually be useful. Most common one, of course, is rubber. The Brazilian rubber tree. Most of our natural rubber comes from that, is extracted from that. And that kind of came from, like, especially when we had people coming to the Americas, um, just to kind of discover the new lands, if you will. They discovered that the indigenous people were kind of using this rubber for different purposes, that even the children would kind of play with the rubber like it was a toy. And so then you're just kind of seeing, oh, there could be other uses for this. And so, of course, with latex primarily for the rubber industry for us, but we may use it also with latex paint and clothing. Of course, we think of latex gloves, right, that we use in different medical settings. So what are some of the plants that may exude kind of this latex sap? So you'll be familiar with this, the Euphorbiaceae family. What's a member of that? Very commonly your poinsettia, right? If all of you have had a poinsettia and you've accidentally brushed by it or cut it, then you've noticed the milky sap that it exudes. Um, the Epocinaceae family, the milkweed family, of course, if you have milkweeds in your garden, then you know that milkweeds kind of secrete the sap when they're broken. The Moraceae family, I mean, these are, in the Asteraceae family. So you kind of have the Moraceae family as your mulberry family, and the Asteraceae family, which is kind of your aster and sunflower family. They do have some members of that family that also exude kind of this latex. Um, Kind of going back to the milkweed family, what's interesting is, with that latex, the Native Americans actually use milkweed latex to help kind of remove calluses from their skin. So that's kind of a unique thing that nobody kind of would think about, but just another function, another thing that was kind of utilized for different purposes. So let's kind of move on from latex and let's talk about tannins. So everyone's probably going to be familiar with tannins. So tannins are found in many different parts of the plants. Traditionally, we think of oak providing tannins that were used to help create leather, right? Help to convert animal hides into leather. That's the most common use that we have with tannins, and for that leather industry. But it is very common for different plant products that such as unripened fruit, um, where you might have high tannin content, where if an animal tries to eat it, it doesn't taste very good. But then as the fruit continues to ripen, it has less tannin contact. That tannin content kind of decreases, if you will. And so the fruit becomes a little bit more edible, kind of the more ripe it becomes. If you think of it from that perspective, like if the seeds within that fruit, if its way to be dispersed naturally is going to be through wildlife, so like through when wildlife eats it and then releases it through fecal matter, it's important that the wildlife is eating the fruit right when those seeds are ready to be eaten. And so that makes sense that wildlife are not going to eat an unripened fruit initially because those seeds may not be ready. But then as it ripens, as it matures, and the seeds are ready that they could be eaten, if you will, to be dispersed, then that tannin content is less and makes it, a little bit more edible for wildlife to enjoy. So kind of a little bit of an example there on tannins. And then finally, I'll talk about one last thing, because we're talking about plants from used for very practical reasons. But what about the spirituality side? Because religion, of course, is very much always been important all across the world. And so plants have a piece in human religion. So let's give some examples here. Let's kind of talk about this. And I mean, really, this list can go on and on about the different purposes of plants that they serve. But for example, in Hinduism and even Buddhism, the lotus flower, this beautiful lotus flower that kind of comes out of the mud, if you will, it brings kind of this new life. It's a symbol of rebirth. It's a symbol of fertility. It's a symbol of spiritual enlightenment in both of these religions. And so, they look on this plant in a very sacred way. And that goes with some other religions as well. And say in Judaism, there are 7 species of different crops that were considered important to the land of Israel. It was kind of a symbol of God's love. And those were crops such as wheat, barley, figs, grapes, pomegranates, olives, and dates, things that were really essential for people back then with their livelihood. Then you get into kind of other interesting aspects of plants with religion, where maybe not so much as for consumption, but maybe it was used in kind of different, um, you know, um, different sacraments, if you will. Maybe it was used in different ceremonies, religious ceremonies. Let's talk about peyote. Peyote, of course, we think of peyote as having these hallucinogenic effects, but to the different indigenous people, this was important to them and utilized for not only medicinal purposes, but they would use it to help induce kind of these visions and commune with spirits from the other world, if you will, or the afterlife. And so that was a very important aspect of their religion and their culture. And then finally, going into even Orthodox Christians, they have this belief that even the simple herb, we think of it as kind of the simple herb basil, actually sprung up from where Jesus's blood fell near his tomb. And so oftentimes this basil is kind of considered more of this sacred plant. It's often associated with the worship of the cross of Jesus. And so there's so much symbolism here with plants and just, among these different religions around the world. And so they provide this kind of respect to these different plants. So, just kind of ending it there, it just kind of goes to show you that, plants can be used for different purposes, that they do have so many benefits to humanity, and not just, I'll say this, not just for traditional survival, but also in this way, maybe more of kind of a psychological, spiritual way as well. Um, so with that, we'll kind of stop. I'm going to stop sharing here. And I'm going to stop recording.